know something about these things and to think about it, okay, and to know what the church teaches. And so we're going to get a little bit more of that tonight. Nikki Coffey Tosley is here, and again, she is from UD, and Nikki and I have known each other for almost a decade. It's amazing. So I'm very pleased to turn it over to her, and she's going to talk about medical issues and health and end of life and all that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always impressed. I've done one of these before. What a great turnout these parishes have for adult education. It's not true in a lot of places, so I'm definitely impressed by that. You should pat yourselves on the back a little bit for caring enough to want to find out more. It's the teacher, yeah. Sue's great. So I wanted to. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what I want to talk about tonight. There's a lot of things I could cover, but I thought I'd start with the question because I want to maybe suggest that medical ethics is a little broader than we sometimes think it is. With this question of what kinds of issues, if someone comes up and says you're going to a talk on medical ethics, what kind of things would you expect to be covered? What kinds of questions? Just throw out a few.
Insurance.
Insurance issues.
In vitro fertilization.
In vitro fertilization.
End of life.
End of life.
Geriatrics.
Geriatrics. Others? Let's have three more.
Euthanasia.
Creating a perfect child, so sort of genetic manipulation. Euthanasia. Abortion. So these are definitely the kinds of things that people think about when they talk about medical ethics. And if any of you have been in healthcare, if you've been to, you probably will have to have gone to some kind of medical ethics talk at some point. If you've been in healthcare in the last 20 years or so. Usually when people talk about medical ethics issues, they tend to focus on really four principles. I've kind of combined them into three here just to save space. But the first one, and the one that, if doctors are talking about medical ethics, it's primarily about patient autonomy, the individual patient's right to choose. And so all these other kinds of things people are talking about tend to get talked about in that kind of umbrella. So it's the patient's decision, give the patient the information they need to make a good informed decision about their health care, about end of life, or about abortion, even things like the choice of the care options they're going to have, or organ donation, or some of the other ones that folks mentioned, in vitro fertilization. But it's all talked about in terms of what that individual person chooses. Pardon me, I'm going to get this chair out of the way because I pace, and that's kind of where I'm pacing. Our right, that right to sort of a personal choice is important, some kind of autonomy, but that can't be the end, right? I think even the main thing when we're talking about medical and health issues from a Catholic or Christian perspective. The other three principles that tend to get talked about are the caregiver's responsibility, the doctors and nurses, to act in the best interest of the patient, coupled with sort of not doing anything, no malfeasance, right? No, you act in the best interest. You don't do anything that will cause harm, and that really covers things like malpractice. And then the last one, which often isn't stressed perhaps as much as it could be, is justice and the distribution of health care. We have a certain amount of resources. How do we distribute that among the population? But I want to argue that there's a whole lot that doesn't cover. The kinds of things, even the ones that people brought up, are things that tend to, maybe once twice in your life you have to make the kinds of decisions about in vitro fertilization or genetic manipulation, abortion. And they're important decisions, but that's not all there is. So I want to talk about health in a broader sense. That these sort of extreme situations are not the only time we should be talking about the morality of our health. It doesn't sort of encompass things like the everyday decisions we make about the food we eat, the exercise, right? Is there a moral obligation to sort of keep our bodies in good shape? Is there a moral obligation to exercise well, right? These are the kinds of questions. And I wanted to extend that even further by looking at the World Health Organization's definition of health. This is really, really broad. The World Health Organization says that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So it doesn't just involve even just our physical bodies, but there's the mental health, and there's the health of our communities. These are all part of our health, and not merely the absence of infirmity. So to be healthy is not simply to not have some disease. And it's possible even you could have some disease and still be healthy in some sense. But it's this overall state of well-being. So what kind of things that may be a surprising definition of health, but what kinds of things would that then encompass?
Where you live, who you live around, what kind of neighborhood it is, what kind of living conditions you live in.
Yeah, so things like, do neighbors support each other? What kind of stress are you kind of surrounded by in your life? I saw your hand up, and then I'll come back.
Can you be permanently disabled and be healthy?
Good question, right? I mean, if health is more broad than this, right? Is there not some level at which you can be disabled or elderly, frail, but still have a kind of a health, a sort of health?
Well, it comes back to what we talked about a few weeks ago, thriving versus just living.
Flourishing.
That's the word. It's actually the usual translation of Aristotle's word. I won't give you the...
Finances play a lot of part in health too.
Pardon?
Finances.
Yep. Right? I mean, nutrition.
There's a lot of things.
Yeah, basic food, water, if we're talking about the developing world.
How about the availability of health care?
Yep. Right, access to health care. What kind of, responsibility do we have as a society to provide health care for people? So the questions that I think are raised by this are and by the way, the World Health Organization says that health, that definition of health, that's a basic human right. And the Catholic bishops would agree. They tend to support that definition. So it raises questions like, what is our corporate responsibility as a community of people, and also as individuals, to care for bodily and mental health, and social health as well on a daily basis? Aren't those moral decisions too? What's our responsibility to create a healthy environment, both a social environment, the physical environment around us, right? I mean, doesn't our health in part depend on the health of the environment, as well as the health of the social structures around us? All these things that promote human flourishing, to come back to that term that you've obviously heard before. So what if schools, workplaces, churches, families, all of our various kind of institutions and structures were actually organized to promote our mental and physical well-being? Being able to imagine that is an important part, I think, of ethics, the ability to imagine what the good might look like, and that the good may be bigger than, more than anything we've seen. I think that God's Garden's a great example of that, of what I'm talking about, that there's good connection between sort of the health aspect of providing people with low income with healthy, good food that takes care of the environment because it's organically grown, that involves a community of people. Right? I think this is a good example of the kind of health that this World Health Organization definition is kind of pointing us towards. But I'd also argue that it's a Christian definition as well. That the sense that health is very broad and that we need to think about the way we organize our society. So these, just to give another kind of example, not from this area, a few years ago, I went down to Honduras with a group of pre-medical students from University of Dayton to do a medical missions down there with a group called Shoulder to Shoulder. It started out as a clinic, one clinic. They now have 3 clinics providing medical care. But as they were there longer, they realized that if we're really concerned about health, we can't just be providing the medical care. We also have to think about feeding programs, right? We're seeing malnourished children, so we've got to get out there with food. And to go even further, they've been working with UD engineering students on providing clean water, right? Because there are all sorts of diseases that are transmitted by dirty water. And then even going further than that, in the last few years, they've been working on providing school education for the girls. Often the boys get sent to school and the girls don't. But what they find, not just in Honduras, but in general in the developing world, is if that women are educated, the health of the family improves, because they're for one, they have more ability to contribute to the economics of the family. And often there are, in many situations, there are better jobs for women than there are for men in some situations of poverty. So I wanted to expand the definition of health. So I think these are one of the kinds of questions that medical ethics doesn't address very often. But I want to talk about a different one. So there's one is like, what else does health include? And the other question I want to sort of raise in this first half, and I meant to say that at the beginning. At the end, we'll be talking about end-of-life issues. This picture is actually from Honduras. A group of kids eating, they're in schools. They're being given a nutritional supplement, basically a protein shake. Another question that often doesn't get raised if we only think about medical ethics is kind of mostly a matter of the rights of individuals to choose their medical care, is what's the limits in the pursuit of health? At what point does health, or even our very lives, become some kind of an idol, where we are so focused on our health and so focused on sort of thinking that we need to go after any medical care, any medical possibility to kind of keep away any kind of feeling of fragility or dependence, to keep death away. That becomes an idol rather than God. Have you talked about the right ordering of goods in any of the a little bit? One of the basics of Catholic moral thought goes back to Augustine. Not that other people weren't saying something similar, is that we have to think about the goods of creation as goods, but of goods that need to be ordered towards God. So healthcare is a good. The material things that we own are goods. They're gifts of God. But they're not ends in themselves, right? So, accumulate. The groups are talking a little bit about sort of our consumerist society, where it's, the idol there is as much, the person who dies with the most stuff wins. Our possessions are good things, they're good gifts, but if that becomes the focus of our life, if those possessions we own aren't used for God's purposes, then we're missing something. And I would say the same thing about health, that medical care, physical health is a good. It's worth pursuing, but it's not our ultimate good. Our ultimate good is God. We can't think that good health is that's the end of the story. It has to be directed so that the goods of creation, the goods God gives us, get directed towards God's purposes. So what's your health for? What are you going to do with your health? And so I think that raises questions about, are there advances, medical advances, that we should be thinking more carefully about? And then let me throw that out to you. Are there things you think that maybe we have a lot of possibilities that didn't exist 100 years ago. Are there things that you think we should, be kind of a little more hesitant about? What I want to say here is that like I said, we try to keep vulnerability, death, kind of at a distance by focusing, putting too much of our hope in medicine sometimes. That vulnerability, illness, and death are part of the human condition. It's part of who we are. They're reminders of our dependence on God, right? That suffering is an opening to spiritual growth. And if we try to sort of hold it off, are we sort of not being open to God's presence sometimes? Do we expect medicine to kind of be the thing that saves us, right, rather than God? To what degree are we creating an idol out of life and health? And to what degree are we looking for health as something that is a good gift of God that we can, because right, our medical abilities, that is a good gift. Which way are we looking at it? Is it becoming an idol, or is it something that we're using for the greater glory of God? I'm certainly not saying, right, that we should never cure a disease, but I do think it puts into question things like some of the other things people are saying. Is it necessarily a good thing to eliminate sickle cell anemia or diabetes from the population? Is it a good thing to be using medicine rather than maybe a more holistic approach to behavior issues, right? And that's not to say that there aren't people with mental illness for whom medicine is really important and helpful. But are we too ready to accept the medical solution? People who are involved in public health will tell you that if you look at kind of over time, the improvements in sort of the health of the American population, the last 50 years, by various measures, it has really not improved. We haven't really extended life that much. Infant mortality really hasn't gone down that much, which are the two markers. There are 2 times in American history where we've seen huge improvements there. The first one had nothing to do with doctors. Anyone want to guess? Clean water. Clean water and sanitation. All sorts of waterborne diseases, tuberculosis as well, cholera. Actually, tuberculosis isn't waterborne. I messed up there. It's airborne, but cholera. Right? Just basic intestinal diseases. People would die from diarrhea.
It's still happening in the development.
In the developing world, right? So that advance, if we really want to improve the world's health, focusing on that rather than medical technology might be better. The other big improvement is, and this is a medical improvement, is the introduction of antibiotics. There was a huge, kind of jump in public health then. But vaccinations and antibiotics were a huge help. But a lot of the stuff we're doing now doesn't seem to be really improving our health as a whole. Well, I don't want to get too far behind here. Generally, though, I love this image, right? This is kind of the image we have of ourselves, I think, in our culture. The idea that the ideal, what it is to have a good life, is to live a life without any kind of pain or illness or struggle. That's a good life. And the idea that we need to be autonomous and independent. If we can overcome that sense of kind of dependency and contingency, that's a good life, right? To be an individual, to not be dependent on anybody, not be a burden on anybody. Death and fragility are kind of an enemy. But we forget that, that's human life. Human life involves dependency and vulnerability. If we're going to love people, if we're going to have health, then we have to also sort of recognize that death is going to be a part of the picture. So I think it may be helpful to talk a little bit about sort of Christian visions of health historically. I want to sort of start with thinking about 2 words, patient and hospital. Think about the origin, like what's underneath those 2 things. The very vocabulary here kind of betrays a Christian understanding of health that we've kind of lost in the way that we think about the words now. But if you think about where they come from, patience. Patience is a virtue. This is actually a doctor in Honduras, by the way. Patience in the Christian tradition is a virtue. It's that virtue that some people have that allows them to be able to sort of have hope in the midst of struggle. To trust in God when things are going wrong. That's what patience is. The ability to kind of endure suffering. So that old idea to be a patient was to be someone who was in that state of suffering. And the ideal sort of patient is someone who has this ability to trust in God in the midst of all that. Or the word hospital. It's related to the word for hospitality. It's been central Christian practice is that sense of, people were talking about it earlier, your house doesn't belong to you, of opening up to those in need, offering care to others. That hospitals are places that do that. And hospitals have their origin in Judaism and Christianity. Certainly from the example of Christ. Christ opened up himself to eating, being with all sorts of people, no matter what their walk of life. People who were sort of looked down on by their society. And he certainly spent much of his time healing others, reaching out to others. And early Christians took that as a model for their own lives. Very early on, and partly on some Jewish models, Christian churches, especially in the cities, within the first couple hundred years after the death of Christ, began to have hospices. And in this sense, a hospice is a place that anyone in need can come. Someone who's hungry, someone who's ill, someone who's dying, someone who just needs a place to be. Gregory of Nyssa was, if you read his writings, talks about this in several places. One of my favorite saints. And that evolved into the monastic tradition of offering hospitality. And this is sort of a kind of an old picture of that. Within this monastery, right, they're welcoming people in, caring for them, praying for them, seeing them through death, right? I'm honestly not entirely sure what's going on here. I think those are supposed to be bags of donations from people who are supporting the hospital. When I first saw this picture, I thought it was limbs, and I was a little worried. But I'm pretty sure it's bags of money, right? That the local, there's the monastic community, but there's also community around them who are supporting it. And there was a sense in which someone who comes to you in need is a blessing to you because they offer you a chance to give charity. We have this sense that beggars, are, we don't want to deal with them, but to see them as a gift to you, as a possibility of showing God to them, as it was in the video that you talked about. And this, developed into Catholic and Protestant hospitals well into the mid-1900s. Most hospitals were run by religious people, whether it was Catholic religious orders or more generally Lutheran hospitals. My mom is a nurse, and she actually started off, I probably shouldn't say this, but she started off at the Catholic hospital. She got mad at the nuns, and she went across town to the Lutheran hospital. But anyway, personal history. But right, there's so just a little taste of this, and there were several orders that were founded around this responsibility to take care of others, this sense of hospitality. One of which was the Hospitallers of St. John. This is a quote from St. John of God. He lived in the late 14, early 1500s. This is description of the hospice that his order is running. So many poor people come here that I very often wonder how I can care for them all. But Jesus Christ provides all the things and nourishes everyone. More than 110 are now living here, sick and healthy, servants and pilgrims. Since his house is open to everyone, it receives the sick of every type and condition, the crippled, the disabled, lepers, mutes, the insane, paralytics, those suffering from scurvy and those bearing the afflictions of old age. Scurvy is a dietary disease, by the way, so that's malnutrition. And above all, countless pilgrims and travelers who come here and for whom we furnish the fire, water, and salt, as well as the utensil to cook their food. So you sort of get this sort of sense of this real mass of humanity that are gathered together in this place of hospitality. That's the origin of hospitals. And again, up until maybe about 1930, most wealthy people or even middle class people did not go to hospitals. You would have been cared for in your home. Hospitals were places where the poorest of the poor went because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And there's a strong sense that among Christians that Christian communities have the responsibility to provide those. And to sort of sum up this part, I turn to the corporal works of mercy. Probably most of you know these, right? They come from Matthew 25. When Jesus is asked about the final judgment, he says that this is what judgment's going to be based on. Have you visited the sick? And all of these, I think, are related to this idea of hospitality. I think the works of mercy actually kind of sum up what hospitality is. And most of these have to do with taking care of people's physical health. Visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, giving drink to those who are thirsty, clothing those that are naked, because if you're exposed to the elements, sheltering the homeless, visiting those in prison, and burying the dead. But this is what it means to have hospitality to others. And it's certainly this connection between disease and health and poverty was there then, and it's there now as well. If you're living in poverty, you're much more likely to be ill, even if you're here in the States, because of the environmental issues, or in the developing world because of malnutrition, dirty water, those kind of things. So. All right, we'll go on, and I do want to start with that question of dignity. With death and dying, for this last, hopefully not half, but it won't take quite as long. And sort of this whole question of making room in our lives for vulnerability and dependency definitely comes into play when we start talking about death and dying. Well, if you Google death with dignity, what you come up with often is sites about assisted suicide. For some people, what it means to die with dignity is sort of, not dying with a lot of suffering, dying by your own choice. But I want to argue here that, well, that kind of dignity that sort of says, I'm only dignified if I'm strong and invincible and not suffering, that's not a Christian idea of what human dignity is. Human dignity is there in the most fragile person, simply because they're human beings, right? That's what the dignity is. And if you think about, there's a quick quote from a song that I really like. I thought about playing the whole song, but there's some bad curse words in it. Because it's actually about someone thinking about someone he met in a bar who's dying of cancer. But the quote that in there says, one thing that's quite clear to me is no one dies with dignity. In that sense of, if you're talking about dignity as invincibility and autonomy, which is the way we think about, our society sometimes thinks about human dignity, rather than, right, the dignity of Christ. We think about Christ's death. In that, in those last times, he certainly suffered. Right? And if that's our model, that's one model of a good death. I think some of the other people actually know people as well. But he was taunted. They made fun of him. He was in pain. He was killed with a bunch of criminals. Right? That's what. And if that's our model, then dignity has to be something different than my invincibility. And a good death has to be something better than my choice to end it or not. Or to sort of, to no longer be a burden on somebody. Because we have this sense in our culture that to be dependent, to be a burden, is somehow a minimization of our dignity. But from a Christian sense, our dignity is based in the fact that we're creations of God, not in any of our abilities, not in anything that we do. It's simply there because of who we are. And people have found that if you do surveys of people, when people talk about a good death, they often say, I want to die in my sleep suddenly with no pain, right? Historically, from a Christian perspective, that'd be the worst thing that could happen to you, to die suddenly without any chance to prepare. Right? And I don't think Christians always think of it that way. If you take judgment seriously, right, you are always prepared. So one of the things this is another very old picture, obviously, of someone being given last rites, right? That soldiers, when they went off to battle, would have confessed before they went into battle, because they didn't want to die, right, without the sacrament of confession. Even Christians don't necessarily think that way. There's studies now that have shown that Christians are actually more likely to resist death, have trouble with death, than people who aren't Christian, which is, I think, really kind of interesting.
Because Christians are afraid there's hell, and the other people don't.
There is that element of it, right? That fear of judgment.
Yeah, it's not fear of death, it's fear of judgment.
There have been some studies that suggest that Christians are actually tend to fear death and be less accepting of death than folks who are more secular. There may be sort of a majority of Christians, but we certainly have these models of what a good, again, going back to the idea of a good death being one that's at the end of a good life, where we kind of accept and sort of recognize this as being part of what it is to live. So then, I want to get real specific here and talk about what the bishops have said. The last part of this talk will be what the bishops have said about end-of-life decisions. But I want to sort of talk really briefly about the tensions first. That for a lot of people, the tension is a tension between, on one hand, we want to prevent any unnecessary suffering. We want to maintain dignity and that sense of invincibility. And then so that then we kind of accept something like assisted suicide or euthanasia. On one hand, or respecting the sanctity of life. And I want to argue from a Christian perspective, that's not quite the tension. It's not about preventing suffering versus caring about life. It's about that tension of sort of acknowledging life as a gift. Again, life is a good. We have to honor that. We have to sort of recognize that gift and protect it at the same time as we accept that death is part of that. And that's the tension as people are working out in a particular situation. What's the action which we should take here? And are we honoring life? Are we accepting death? How do we work out this particular decision we have to make? And if we start with there are directives for Catholic hospitals, which is where the U.S. bishops, USCCB stands for, I think most of you know this, but the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, that they have made for Catholic hospitals. And the first one actually doesn't talk so much about the end-of-life decisions as it does preparation. Sort of recognizing that the first thing is making sure that people are prepared. So making sure that, and I've sort of highlighted some with italics, that people are provided with the spiritual support as well as the opportunity to receive the sacraments. Right? That's the first thing. Before you any other kinds of decision, making sure that people have that spiritual support. And also the information that they need. There's kind of a part here that's really about informed consent, that the people making the decisions are given by the doctors and other care people the information they need to make good decisions. This is the stuff. This is getting down to the nitty-gritty. So what is the moral obligation? Well, this is the way it's stated, that we have the moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving life. So what does that mean? Well, proportional means are those medical interventions that in the judgment of the patient, or they don't say this, or the caregivers, the patient's unable to make these decisions, that offer reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. So they're...
What defines excessive expense?
These are prudential decisions, right? So what is, and it differs. I mean, that's one of the tensions with this definition, is it differs depending on where you are. The other side of that is that you can forego extraordinary disproportionate means, which are those that, in the patient's judgment, do not offer a reasonable hope of benefit, or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. So,
what if the patient's judgment and the caregiver's judgment are in conflict?
Or if two different caregivers, right? Is this really an individual's choice, or is it something that an individual sort of makes within a family and a communal structure, right? And these are difficult definitions, they're not easy. So I just sort of recaptured the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. And this is a definition that goes back a long time. People, 600 years ago were talking about this difference. But what constitutes ordinary and extraordinary means changes. Not just depending on time, but also depending on where you live. So for instance, the classic example for in ethics of what extraordinary and ordinary means was, for the first few hundred years, was the question of, do you cut off a limb that's gangrenous? Do you have a moral obligation to preserve your life by cutting off a limb? Now we think, well, that seems pretty ordinary to us. But, without anesthetic, without sterile conditions, where you can't even really guarantee that you're going to stop the gangrene and not cause some other infection, it was considered extraordinary means to amputate a limb but that was kind of the classic case. Now, where we can do it sterilely, under anesthetic, you probably, it seems pretty ordinary that you've got, even if you're going to miss that limb, that you should preserve your life. It also differs greatly depending on where you are. A lot of these kinds of end-of-life decisions do not even occur as choices in the developing world. And I think it's really helpful to remember that most people actually never have the choice of these extraordinary means, or even some of the ordinary means that we think of as being ordinary. So an excessive burden on a family here may be really different than an excessive burden on a family in Honduras, right, who can't even afford some of the basic things that we take for granted. I think the harder decisions are, questions like the Terry Schiavo case. Probably a lot of you recognized her face. Schiavo was anorexic, and it injured her heart to the point where she had a heart problem, and she ended up being brain damaged. And there was some dispute about this, but the doctor said in a persistent vegetative state, which basically means there's no brain activity. Her parents thought that there was some, which is part of the tension. This is that conflict between caregivers, right? She was not able to make any decisions. Her husband wanted to take her off of artificial nutrition, not provide with the feeding tube. Her parents, and based on Catholic principles, wanted her to continue to be fed. So is that extraordinary or is that ordinary?
Is that Catholic principles to be fed each by two?
Well, it wasn't so clear when the Schiavo case was, and then there's been an addition to the Catholic directives that says yes, it is. In most cases, there's kind of a presumption in favor of providing artificial nutrition, but there's room there for recognizing that these are prudential decisions, and they're things you have to really look at that particular case and sort of see what's an excessive burden. Is there really a reasonable hope?
What about, okay.
I'm sorry, you said that's the current Catholic ideology? Because I think that's interesting, because what's the statement? Life is precious from conception until natural death. Sticking a hose in my throat and shoving food down it isn't very natural. Eating is, but my eating, not you shoving it into me, I don't think that's naturally wrong.
But there's an expectation that
Questions? Sorry.
you might come out of it, indeed, shove the hose down your throat and force feeding it, if there's a chance that you will recover.
I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
Okay.
It's just, it's certainly not natural. I'm all for, if you in your heart feel that, okay, this person will survive and have a meaningful life. And my wife and I both agree, having a meaningful life. For me, when we were talking about, I think I'm prepared to die tonight if that's the way it works out. I'm not going for that, but if that happens, okay. But I'm also planning for next week, because I like next week. I like having stuff to do and doing stuff. And for me, my life really ends when I can't do that anymore. And that's going to be very hard for me, is My grandmother lived to be 100 years old, but she was still stitching quilts until she was 98.
100.
Yeah, not quite, but pretty close. And
So quality of life.
quality of life is very important.
But as the older you get, the more you modify what you want to do.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And there's, again, I think the question is, does the quality of life depend on our abilities to do things, or is the quality of our life and our dignity wrapped up in kind of simply being human?
Can you fulfill?
But these
your
are not
expectations?
easy decisions. I kind of want to make sure that I don't run completely out of time and keep you guys here late. So let me just kind of go over what the current, and this is after the Shiloh case, directive says, which is that in principle, there's an obligation to provide patients with food and water, including medically assisted nutrition and hydration for those who cannot take orally. So in principle, right, that's the presumption. Including persistent vegetative state, which was her condition, a state in which you cannot, your brain really is damaged to the point it can't recover. They become morally optional, though, when they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life, or when they would be excessively burdensome for the patient, would cause significant physical discomfort, for example, resulting from complications in the use of the means employed. So there's room here for making, in good conscience, moral judgments about that particular case. And as I said, I think these require prudence. You probably talked about a little bit about prudence, that virtue of being able to direct your actions towards the good, to discern the right action. And that includes sort of making sure you're sort of thinking about intent, because intent matters in Catholic moral theology. So what is your intent in removing that feeding tube or whatever it is? But they aren't simply a matter of choice. This is an activist from in Oregon. They passed the law allowing a physician-assisted suicide, and this is from one of those demonstrations. So I think that what's helpful to sort of remember here is that there's the presumption in favor of using the means that we have to save life, to extend life at the end of life. But that presumption is balanced out by sort of being able to weigh the burdens in terms of pain, financial cost, emotional cost on the families involved. And those are difficult decisions, and I would say best made in community with other people, maybe who've gone through the same thing, who are part of your religious community. That they're not necessarily decisions we make alone, they're decisions we make with the help of other people who can help us, because it's hard in the midst of it to think very clearly. We had to make some of these kinds of decisions with my mom, and I know when you're in the midst of it, it's hard, and it really helped to have other people we trusted around us to talk through those kinds of questions. We had to make the decision whether to put my mom through another surgery when there was very little hope that it would. And at that point, she'd lost most of her functions. Whether that the surgery would do much for her. So I just want to leave, and then so we do have about 10 more minutes. So throughout these general questions, which I think are some of the questions I'm trying to raise throughout this talk. One is, how do we kind of find this balance between maintaining the sanctity of life without making life into some kind of an idol, or refusing to see death as a stage of life, right? That tension. Life is sacred, it's a gift of God, but at the same time, death is part of life. Then again, what do we lose as a society if we seek to eliminate all fragility and dependency? Some people kind of raise some questions about what that does to our kids in particular. Do we have a false or idolatrous idea of the perfect body or the perfect health, the perfect life? Right? Is that kind of getting in the way of our dependency on God? And then the last one, what do those who are ill or suffering teach us about humility, vulnerability, and dependence? Which are, in the example, go back to the beginning to the example of Christ, as one who is willing to be vulnerable and suffer. If that's our model for what a good life looks like, we need to at least sort of make room in our lives for that. We have about 5 more minutes, I think, for other questions, 5, 10 more minutes for other questions, for comments or...
I don't understand the directive,
Okay.
suggestion from the bishops about leaning toward, feeding tubes and IVs and all that. And then accepting death as a stage of life. If if you break your arm, for heaven's sakes, get it fixed. But, when you are very old and you are very ill, shoving a tube is torturous.
Well, there is that part about pain, right, if it's going to cause...
Gonna cause pain.
Well, when I cannot tell you how many times my daddy put his hand out and took my arm and would point to the guy in the bed next to him and say, "Don't let them do those kinds of things to me." What is his family thinking? I said, "I love you, Daddy, I won't do that." You don't put someone 94 through that stuff.
Like I said, these are not easy decisions, and I think that they're trying to err on the side of us not treating life too loosely, of not allowing things like assisted suicide.
Sure.
And so I think this is the tension. But I think that these are
Not so much.
the judgment of what constitutes excessive burden. Is something that you make in the midst of real life, right? It's hard to make that in the abstract. We have to make these decisions on the ground in the midst of dealing with people suffering. I'd add to that durable power of attorney, not just the legal side of it, but having those conversations within the family is so crucial to the people to make these conversations.
13 years ago, I was on full life support. I'd been full life support for over 3 months. The doctors told my wife, "Why are you putting him through this? We suggest you disconnect him." I'm glad she didn't.
I have a friend who's alive because her husband ignored her living will. Her DNR. So those are the counter examples too. That the best medical advice can sometimes be wrong.
What does the church say about the living will?
It's not in the directives necessarily, but there is, in that first part that I read, sort of a suggestion that people should be talking about it, should know, within families. But there's not an official statement on it. There are people who argue both ways about the usefulness of living wills, but again, because it's hard to make statements about care in the abstract. There's still the need in that situation to be looking at that particular situation. You can't in the abstract sort of decide, is this going to be excessive, extraordinary, or is it going to be ordinary? Because in many cases it would be ordinary, in some it might be extraordinary.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Great job. So we talked a lot again. Every week we talk about the value of virtue and the need to be virtuous people. So let's say our prayer for virtue again before we go, please. Absolute and all-knowing God, nothing is hidden from your sight. From the very beginning, all knowledge has existed within you. Kindly share your knowledge with me, permitting my soul to understand it and wisdom to agree with its outcome. Provide me with the gift of justice to apply this received knowledge with prudence. Grant me fortitude to ensure the fulfillment of your will, so to live in the love and freedom you desire for all the world. Amen. Thank you very much for being here, and keep thinking.